Thank you very much. Let me express my appreciation to Rick for extraordinarily gracious introduction. And I also want to say how much I don't appreciate Frank Luntz for all the things that he said about language, because now I've got to rewrite my entire speech and make sure that it works. Actually, Frank Luntz is one of the smartest people in the world of politics today. It always is refreshing to hear him, and it's usually very entertaining as well. And I'm so delighted that he was part of this luncheon. And I'm going to say thanks to Phil King and all of the people at ALEC for giving me what I believe to be is an extraordinary opportunity to share a few moments with you here today. I'm grateful for ALEC. I'm grateful for the fact that you focus on how to solve the problems that everyone sees at government at the most local level. I'm convinced that Washington is dysfunctional, broken, and incapable of coming up with the kind of solutions that Americans need. And I'm not talking about the Americans in the donor class. They're going to be just fine. Don't worry about the donor class. And that's why they give to Democrats and Republicans alike, and it's also why we never see change in Washington. Republicans get elected, and we expect great change, and what happens? Nothing happens often, because the same donors who toss the dollars at the feet of the Democrats toss the same dollars at the feet of the Republicans, and they get the same dance. And so the donor class feeds the political class, who takes it out on the working class, and the people that you rub shoulders with every day, the kind of people who lift heavy things and who sweat through their socks while they're at work, are taken in the gut. I cannot imagine that there's one of us in this room that believe that if we went out and worked to help get Republicans elected to get the majority in the Senate and add to the majorities in the House, that they would go and forget that they were essentially elected to put the brakes on executive overreach on things like Obamacare and illegal immigration. I mean, many people in America, even Democrats, were concerned that the president, who said he couldn't do anything about immigration reform, 23 different times he said it. And then somehow he said that he had a pen and a phone, and he could do it anyway. And so we sent Republicans there thinking that they were going to remember why they went. And instead of doing anything about executive overreach, they actually gave the president more power in relationship to a trade bill that even Republicans didn't want. That would mirror so many of the other trade bills, which, while we're all for free trade, we are not for free trade when it isn't fair trade. We are not for free trade when it means that the trading partner cheats, dumping illegal products into this country, making it so that the people who live and work in your districts lose their jobs. When we allow the trading partner to steal intellectual property and manipulate their currency, which means our exports are worth nothing. And so we watch in our communities 5 million manufacturing workers losing their jobs since the year 2000. 60,000 manufacturing plants have closed since the year 2000. And the one thing we hoped was that our guys would go and do something different. And they didn't. I realize ALEC is a nonpartisan organization. There are Democrats here and Republicans. And I'm glad it is an organization that is not just for one party or the other. It's about ideas. Now, if I sound a little Republican, gosh, I can't help it. I am a Republican. I'm not just Republican, I'm running for president. You may wonder, well, why did we get some guy running for president to come speak ALEC? Do you know how hard it was to get a Republican who wasn't running for president this year? Just turn it around the room and say, who's not running for president? Raise your hand. It's easier than asking who is. Yes, it's a crowded stage, a crowded field. I get all that. I'm also aware that because it is so crowded, it makes it very difficult for those of us who are running to even get noticed sometimes. I was in South Carolina last week, and I was campaigning. I went into a diner, shook hands, started talking to people. Went up to a guy and said, "Hello, I'm Mike Huckabee. I'm running for president." He said, "Yeah, me and my buddies were just laughing about that this week." But let me tell you something nobody's laughing about. A country that is in true trouble, economically, militarily, and let me add, a country in trouble morally. I understand how that the donor class would prefer that we only speak of the challenges of this country in terms of economics and national security. And yes, those are the two things that will be front and center, I'm sure, of the debates, front and center of so many people's minds. And sometimes people will ask this question: Governor, what do you think is the most important issue that we face? Is it the economy? Is it the joblessness? Is it the fact that there are people who just a few years ago had a full-time job that paid good wages, plus benefits and maybe even a pension? And now some of those same people are working 2 and 3 part-time jobs with no benefits and certainly no pension. Is that the biggest thing that faces this country? Is it the $18 trillion plus debt that we have raised, which is, by the way, doubled in this administration from all of the 43 previous presidents combined? And they'll say, is that the most important? Or is it national security? Is it protecting ourselves against radical jihadism? And sometimes when people ask me the question, what's most important, my response is, that's like asking me which wing of the airplane is most important, the one on the left or the one on the right? Because every time I get on an airplane, I want to make sure that both those wings are firmly attached to fuselage. It just flies better that way. But I would suggest to you that even if both wings are firmly attached to the fuselage, there's one other component for that airplane to make sure that it flies. And it has to have a steering mechanism. It has to have the rudders, the ailerons, the flaps to provide the capacity for lift and descent and for steering. And just having wings, even wings with very strong engines, does not mean that airplane can successfully fly. It has to have steering mechanism. I would suggest that it's not enough for us to talk about the economic challenges that we face and how to fix them, the national security risks that we face, and there are many, and how to confront them. But we cannot resolve the real issues of this country if we do not also recognize that at the foundation of our civilization is our moral compass that gives us the right to govern, the right to be free, the right to be a great nation, and the capacity to do those very things and to lead our people to a better future. Without a moral people, we can't be a successful, prosperous people. And there is no way to separate the morality of our nation from even the monetary policy and success of our nation. You know this from budgeting in your states. The more people that go to prison, the fewer dollars you have to send someone to college. It costs more money to put a person in prison for a year than it does to put a person in a 4-year college or university also for a year, pay full tuition, room and board, buy books, and give them spending money. And today we face many crises on all fronts. And for us to somehow pretend that we should address one or only two of those issues is to fail to understand that in the origin of this country, 239 years ago this month, when this nation was given birth by 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, from that moment forward, there is no other explanation for the existence and the continuance of this country apart from the intervention of the providence of Almighty God. There is simply no other way to explain America. I believe for the most part that while those of us in this room who are the political practitioners, we tend to see everything horizontally, which is part of our problem. We argue over things, whether they're left or right, liberal or conservative, Democrat or Republican, and we tend to think that if we could just move the country to the right or move it to the left, that somehow everything would be okay. I'm unapologetically and unabashedly a conservative. If you want to put me on the horizontal spectrum, I'm definitely on the right. But I never would have been elected in the atmosphere of Arkansas, where only 3 Republicans had been elected statewide in 150 years before me. I never would have become governor in the bluest state in America, which probably surprises you because I'm sure you thought it was Massachusetts or Vermont or Maine or Oregon or California. It was not, it was Arkansas. Ted Mullenix, who's here, and we were sitting at the table together, we were reminiscing about the fact that when I became governor, there were 89 Democrats to 11 Republicans in the House, 31 Democrats to 4 Republicans in the Senate. It was the most lopsided legislature in the entire country. When people say, how did you get elected? How did you stay? How did you ever get anything done? Let me assure you, it was not because I invited people to jump up on an elephant and ride down Capitol Avenue. It's because I understood that for those of us who play the political game, we see things horizontally. But for the vast majority of people out there who vote for or against us, they don't look at life like that. They don't look at politics like that. They look at life vertically. And what they want to know is not, are you going to take us right or left? They want to know, are you going to take us up or will you take us down? And if they perceive that what we want to do is to take them up and make life better for their kids and their grandkids, they don't care so much about whether we're left or right. And this country, I believe, is at a point where people care a whole lot more whether we're going up or down rather than just right or left. And one of the challenges that we face is, how do we wrestle control away from a Washington that is completely detached from the passions, the needs, the concerns of the people that you rub shoulders with every day in the grocery store, at church, and sitting in a Little League game? And one of the reasons that I'm so very supportive of the national effort to invoke Article 5 of the Constitution is because it is the only way we will ever be able to devolve power away from Washington back to the states as the founders of this great country intended it to be. The genius of our Constitution, and it's nothing short of inspired, is that throughout the document there was such concern on the part of the founders that government might one day get too big, too powerful, too concentrated, too centralized, that they built in all kinds of checks and balances so that there'll always be a way to rein that power away from the few and redistribute it back to the many. And as one of the safeguards, Article 5, rarely understood, perhaps even acknowledged, are known about by people who teach political science and government in our major universities, especially those. The fact is, this was the founders' way of invoking that one fail-safe way to keep our government from spiraling out of control and out of touch with the rest of reality. I'm hoping that as people understand Article 5 and the power of it and the value of it, that we will see state legislatures across America use the only power that's left to us, apart from some kind of massive revival in Washington, and restore the balance of power. When you have a president who says, I have a pin on the phone, and who ignores the Constitution, and who gets away with it because Congress doesn't have the guts to stop him, when you have a Supreme Court which has become the extreme court, a court that doesn't understand that there are 3 branches of government and all of them are equal to each other, and one can't override the other 2, and when you have Ivy League law schools teaching people that the Supreme Court creates the law of the land, and then that gets repeated by people, even elected people, governors, senators, congressmen, judges and law school professors, even though there's not one shred of truth to the idea that the Supreme Court can create a law, because it doesn't have that power. It can review a law, it can interpret a law, but only the legislature can pass the enabling legislation that actually creates a law, and then it has to be signed and enforced by the executive branch. And when the extreme court, which now seems to think it's the supreme being, recently decided that it could redefine marriage based on some out-of-the-thin-air understanding of words like spirituality and intimacy, not at all based on law or precedent, overturning its own ruling from 2 years before that said it didn't have the power to regulate marriage. When an extreme court takes that tact, then it's not enough for us to wring our hands and say, well, it's the law of the land. There's nothing we can do. That ship has sailed. It is not the law of the land because 5 unelected lawyers in black robes said it. They don't have that power. We need a president who says, thank you very much, court, but until the elected representatives of the people pass such a notion and find basis for it in law, and unless the president signs it and agrees to enforce it, we have your thoughtful opinion, for which we are grateful, but we are not going to act upon it because you are only one of 3 branches and you can't make law. That's how we need to approach these out-of-control decisions. And by the way, there's precedent. Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln. The most obvious case is the 1857 Dred Scott decision that the Supreme Court said that black people weren't fully human. I don't know of anyone who defends that Supreme Court law. I don't know of anyone who today would wring his or her hands and say, well, it's the law of the land. There's nothing we can do about it now. The Supreme Court can no more redefine marriage than it can suspend the laws of gravity. It simply doesn't have that power. And today we sometimes fret over organizations like Planned Parenthood. We've seen the videos. They're shocking, they're disturbing, they're sickening, and they show something that is beneath the dignity of civilized people. That people would crush and dismember an unborn child and sell the parts of the body as if they were selling the parts to a Buick. And casually and callously talk about it over lunch as if these were inanimate objects not related to anything human. And I wonder, when are we going to have the courage to invoke the 5th and the 14th Amendments to the Constitution and recognize that it is the distinct obligation of the government of the United States to protect people equally and to accept that in the Declaration of Independence, our country was founded on the notion that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all of us are created equal, and we are endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I say today that it is not enough for us simply to say we need to defund Planned Parenthood, which of course we do. There's no way in heaven that $500 million plus of our tax money ought to go so an organization can continue the barbarism of slaughtering babies, and selling their parts. But it's more than that. It's time for us to have the thoughtful discussion that we cannot expect the world to respect and honor and believe that the United States represents the best of humanity if on one hand we condemn genocide in other nations but practice infanticide in our own. It is time that our morality match our principles. Let me say there's some things that a country's got to do to be able to be free, and it needs to happen at the local level. We've got to be able to feed ourselves. We've got to be able to fight for ourselves, and we must be able to fuel ourselves. When I say feed ourselves, I mean that God help us if we ever start importing the food that we put on our tables. Thank God we have the best agricultural system in the world, and the food and the fiber that we produce means that only about 7% of a family's budget has to be used to take care of our needs to eat. This is important because it means we have so much more money at our disposal in a diverse economy. In Europe, they spend twice that much. In most third world nations, it's almost 50% of everything they get, and that's just to get a couple of bowls of rice and beans every day. But if a country begins to import its food and let someone else feed them, then they're held hostage by whoever it is who's feeding them. It's not just about making agricultural markets strong, it's about making our country secure. And it's one reason that the overreach of the EPA, which means that in many cases a farmer is treated as if he doesn't know the difference between a mud puddle and a wetland. We need to quit having those decisions made by idiots in concrete jungles in Washington and made at your level at the local government. We need to be able to fight for ourselves. By that I mean we need to be able to manufacture our own tanks and trucks and bombs and bullets. Because if we can't make our own airplanes and ships, and we depend on somebody else to make the finished product, or for that matter to make the parts, then whoever it is who's making the weapons with which we fight for ourselves, that's who owns us. Why don't we put Americans to work making things again? Well, part of it is because we have a tax and regulatory system that has chased jobs away from our people and sent them to Mexico, to China, to Indonesia, and other parts of the world. We cannot be a free nation if we're a nation that cannot fight for itself. And that's why any trade deal we have needs to make sure that it truly does empower Americans to have the jobs. It's why I'm a strong supporter of the fair tax, which is not just taking the screwdriver and tweaking the tax code a little bit. We're way past the position where we can afford the luxury of a few little taps of the screwdriver or hammer. We need to scrap the entire system that punishes productivity and rewards irresponsibility. We need the fair tax, which taxes us at the point of consumption, not at the point of producing something, because at that point we do several things. We transform the economy by bringing working capital back to this country that's been chased offshore. We bring manufacturing jobs back that have been rushed off because everything we make in this country has 22% embedded tax built into it because we tax labor and capital versus the zero tax built into products that are made overseas and shipped to sit next to those American products in the showroom floor. And it creates the capacity to have a reliable funding stream for programs like Social Security and Medicare, which are running out of money because very few people even make their money through wages anymore. The vast amount of American wealth now comes through investments and dividends. And the result is we now have people who are trying to work under the table. You want to resolve the issue of illegal immigration? Sure, fix the border. I'll promise we can do it in a year. You say, how? Because 73 years ago, we built a 1,700-mile road from British Columbia to Alaska, 1,700 miles of road in the winter. With the technology of 73 years ago, of course we can secure our border. That was done, that road, in less than a year. But then we have to decide, how do we really deal with the issue when you make it where it is not advantageous economically to be under the table but above board? You transform the dynamics of the whole process. In the fair tax, everybody pays when they consume, but you don't have people who are working under the table both as an employer or as an employee. That's transformative. But we've got to be able to fuel ourselves. And to fuel ourselves means that we need to stop being an importer of any energy. A country that has several hundred years of energy under its own feet, whether it's oil, gas, coal, wind, solar, nuclear, hydro, is a country that should not import one iota of energy to our shores ever, ever again. But to do that, we've got to rein in the EPA, move those regulations back to the state, because under this administration, disapprovals by the EPA are up 190%. The EPA has had takeovers of state programs to the tune of 2,750%, programs that ought to be administered closer to the people. What we should be doing in our energy policy so that we can fuel ourselves is explore, expand, exploit, and export. And here's what happens. We bring the prosperity to Americans. We put millions of Americans to work in the energy industry. Would a few Americans probably get rich? Yeah, they probably would. Guess what? I'm fine with that. Because I'd much rather for some Americans to get rich and for a lot more Americans to have jobs than I had to continue to see us enrich the Saudis, who take the money and then sponsor the madrasas that teach the terrorists how to fly airplanes into our building. I'd rather see us take the prosperity from energy and stop giving it to the Iranians. We should never be in this deal. We should put the thumbtacks on them even tighter and take them out of the energy game, not accelerate their capacity to expand from oil to nuclear. And we should be exporting energy, because if we take Russia's one great asset away, and America becomes the energy exporter to Europe, to Africa, and Asia, we not only enrich Americans, but we change the balance of world power, and the bad actors no longer will have the funding to do the things that threaten the peace and security of this world. This, my friend, is why energy and a realistic approach is critical. But I'm going to close by telling you the other reason that this matters. It's not just about the jobs, or just about bringing the prosperity back to the country. Noble goals indeed. It's not even just about the disruption of the balance of power. But there's another incredible benefit that I think you can understand because you work with people every day. If you ever watch a single mom strap kids into a car seat, take them to daycare, drop them off, then go to work, you watch her at the gas pumps filling up her car, just remember that the difference between $4 a gallon gasoline and $1 a gallon gasoline is the biggest pay raise she'll ever have. The reason we need to get energy front and center in this country is for all of the reasons of national security and prosperity, jobs, but it's also so that she gets a pay raise. And it's for that 84-year-old woman in South Arkansas who on a hot August day when it's 105 and she can't afford to turn on her air conditioner, she can turn it on and get it down where it's cool and she doesn't swelter through another summer day. When we talk about the people that we're supposed to serve, it's those folks too. And there's a lot of people in this country who are hurting. I was in Aiken, South Carolina 2 weeks ago, and I met a guy at 6 o'clock in the morning at breakfast at the Fairfield Inn in Aiken. He was working, picking up the dishes. I was the only person down there at that time of morning. And we got to talking. His name is Mark. He was working at a company there in Aiken. 3 years ago, 300 people at that company all lost their jobs. It was a manufacturing facility. He was a college-educated accountant for that company, but his job was gone too, along with the manufacturing jobs on the floor. 300 people lost jobs. He's now working 3 jobs, 3. One of them was going in at 5:30 in the morning and working the breakfast shift at the Fairfield Inn in Aiken. 2 others. He had no options. His house is almost paid for. He has to do something. And here's a guy who just a few years ago had a really good job. And now those jobs belong to another country. I'm tired of America shipping jobs, economic prosperity, and my grandkids' future to some other nation. I'm not against caring about the whole world. I do. I care about it all. But I want you to be clear. I'm not a globalist. I'm not a person who believes that it's more important that somebody halfway around the world is okay my heart and soul, I am unapologetically an American. And I want this country and our children and our grandchildren to prosper and be free. And that's why we need to get this country back in shape. You're the ones who will help do that. Let's get Article 5 passed, get the power out of Washington back to the local government where the founders intended it to be, and let's make sure that freedom rings, that freedom rings. God bless you. Thank you for letting me visit with you today.